everyone, and welcome to the Ostrom Workshop. Welcome to the Colloquium series.
Hope I get
We are very lucky to be joined today by a distinguished professor, Fred Cate, here at IU. Professor Cate, of course, is our Vice President for Research here on campus, has a huge and wonderful background in information privacy, security, and AI, as you saw in the piece that we'll be discussing today, co-authored with Rachel Dockery, who's also sitting right over there. For those of you who aren't aware, Fred's worn a lot of different hats over the years here at IU. He is the founder of CACR, or Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research, and also served as the managing director for the Center for Law, Ethics, and Applied Research and Health Information. He's the author of more than 150, I'm sure that number is low at this point, it's probably more, articles and books. He's generated more than $10 million in external research funding and is sitting on lots of cool boards. I'm not even going to name all of these, but just a couple that stand out. The National Security Agency's Privacy and Civil Liberties Panel, the National Academy of Sciences Forum on Cyber Resilience, and Intel's Privacy and Security External Advisory Board. He's also done a lot of wonderful things with Oxford Press, and as you guys saw, has a really deep interest now in engagement with the field of AI governance, which really cuts across a lot of these different fields, as we'll talk about today. So per usual, we'll go through a quick little, five. Please summarize your research in 5 or so minutes here. We'll kind of tee it up with some discussion questions here, and then I'll keep tabs as we go around. Okay. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us today, Fred.
Thank you very much, Scott. I really appreciate it, and I don't want to go any further without acknowledging again Rachel, who I do all of this work with, and I'm delighted that you're here and that I didn't forget to acknowledge you. So Scott asked me if I'd like to present at the Ostrom Workshop, and I was delighted. In fact, I couldn't think of any greater honor. And then, it was 3 months later, you said, "Oh, and you have 5 minutes to do this."
That's it.
And I would never have accepted if I only got 5 minutes because I'm not that organized. But let me just say a few things briefly, and really mainly for the purpose of teeing up a discussion. I mean, there's no presentation. I certainly don't have slides or anything like that. One is, and again, I'm happy to discuss any of these, but AI is real. It's here. We're in sort of the fourth revolution of AI. It dates back to the 1950s. A lot of people who lived through those earlier revolutions are probably more profoundly concerned about the amount of hype around it this time. But to be honest, most of the kind of challenging mathematical theory problems have been solved. So we are now living in a world in AI. Everyone is carrying AI devices with us. We're driving in them. We're living in them. There's no reason to sort of think about this as a future. This is, without any question, the present. So what do we mean when we talk about AI? So I'm using the term really broadly, but to sort of mean the notion of when computers don't have to just carry out the instructions that they are told to do, but rather can innovate on their own. And innovation can come about in many ways, and there are two that are sort of the most obvious to us. One is sort of computer vision. So we see amazing AI applications in healthcare right now, because you can show a computer like an image of someone's retina, and they can diagnose diabetes, they can diagnose hypertension. We now have a new experiment underway, not peer-reviewed, where they think they can diagnose Alzheimer's, all because a computer is that good at looking at an image. It's not seeing anything you or I don't see, it just knows what to do with it. It can combine it with other data. The other sort of really prominent example is natural language processing. And again, this is something that the Defense Department had worked on for years and years and years, and then Google and a handful of other companies really just punched right through this, so that today we see this extraordinary ability to translate language, to take human instructions or to convert from one language to another. Google does it in real time between more than 100 languages in and out of, not perfectly by any means, does it from images, and now is starting to work on doing it straight from video, so that you could literally hold up your camera, record what I'm saying. On the other end, you would hear me saying in another language. And this is a classic AI type of thing. Learns lots of bits of things, lots of vocabulary, lots of things about human voices, and puts it all together in a way that lets it deliver something new. It's not just a concrete thing. So this presents enormous challenges around data protection and around information security. And I mean this in multiple ways, and I don't have time to talk about these other than just to put stakes in the ground around them. So one of them is that privacy and data security are going to be really important around AI. AI uses massive volumes of information. That's what makes it work. You might think of it in a sort of research context. Instead of sampling data, it uses all data. And as a result, getting things like privacy and security right are going to really matter. Moreover, we use AI in ways that are critical. They are fatal if we don't get it right. So if the plane doesn't fly, if the car doesn't break, if you are not diagnosed with the correct disease, people die as a result of this. So this isn't some theoretical, how do I feel about it thing. This is really practical, imminent harm. And adding to that complexity is the fact often we now use AI in places without any human intervention at all. So again, my car, if it thinks it's going to hit the car in front of me, it brakes. It doesn't matter what I say or what I think, it's going to stop. Well, if it's making that incorrectly and it stops me suddenly in the middle of traffic or it stops too quickly, again, people die, namely me, and there's no chance for human intervention. So again, getting the security stuff right, getting the privacy stuff right, really matters. But I also mean this challenge in the sense that AI is really showing how bad our approaches to both privacy and security have been, and particularly from a governance point of view. So many of the characteristics around our approaches, very different, by the way, in privacy and security, but in both cases, it's highlighting enormous failures in those areas. So let me just quickly touch on those two stakes, and then I will shut up. So on the AI challenging the norms, that's pretty much what the piece that Rachel and I wrote was about. You see that. So, data protection beginning back in the 1980s is really based on this notion of, collect no more data than necessary, don't use it for anything you don't have permission for. It's a sort of transactional model. Like I collected it, I agreed to certain terms, now those terms should govern. Well, AI doesn't work like that. AI is all about repurposing data. Nobody ever collects data just for the purposes of AI. You're collecting it usually for some other purpose, and then you're using it. That's how we learned, for example, to do all this natural language processing. Google had access to a volume of data that nobody had access to before, and it was the volume of data that made it work. So now if you say, no, you can't reuse of that data is prohibited, or you have to delete the data now, you no longer have the purpose for which you originally collected it, or you have to explain what you're doing to the data subject. Well, in many cases, we don't even know who the data subject was. If Google looks at 1 million instances of people going between French and English, it doesn't care less about who they are, it's just collecting the actual underlying data. So privacy law would say collect more data about the individual so you can go back and tell them what you've done in an effort to undermine their privacy as we would talk about protecting their privacy. These are the types of challenges that are frankly proving staggering in this area, and it's one of the real tensions we see on a day-to-day basis, particularly in Europe with a new general data protection regulation, 1 year old, I shouldn't keep calling it new, is particularly proving challenging. On security, we see much the same, except it's just the opposite, which is security, we've taken an incredibly laissez-faire approach. We have almost no centralized controls. We have very few legal obligations outside of specific industries. And if this is the model we use for AI, it's going to suddenly be too late. I mean, we will discover we are, if you cross the border now in most airports, it's all done through an automated system. And right now, there's still a human there if it goes wrong, but pretty soon there's not going to be a human there. The reason we are adopting this is to alter what it costs to do these things. So just the second point, I just want to expand on just 1 second. How do we do better? In other words, how do we evolve a regulatory approach, a governance approach, whether or not it involves regulation? And we are really seeing some very hard questions. So, for example, one is who does it? Right? Who in a government, who in a society is charged with doing this? And one of the first things Rachel and I saw when we looked at this issue in Europe is you find this amazing duality. Most major European governments issue parallel AI reports. So the French Data Protection Commissioner will issue one about how bad it is, and the French Parliament issues one about how wonderful it is. And the House of Lords issues one about how wonderful it is, and the ICO, the Independent Commissioner's Office, issues one about how bad it is. And we see this again and again, where it all depends on who you ask, as to how you perceive this phenomenal use of data, the extraordinary use of data by AI. But there also were fundamental questions about sort of the what. We don't really have standards in this area. What's fairness in the context of AI? What's fairness in general? We think we know what unfairness is. What's discrimination? Is it adequate that AI be less discriminatory than just letting random people make choices? What do we consider adequate? So we now have, for example, our first recorded instance of a self-driving car killing a pedestrian. Very serious. On the whole, it's still 1,000 times safer technology than letting humans behind the wheel. Are we going to say, no, you can no longer allow self-driving cars because it killed somebody? How about if we just say no non-self-driving cars because they're much less safe than having self-driving cars? How are we going to go about even thinking about those issues? And the last example I would give there is one just because I don't have any idea what the answer is, and I warned Scott that I would have no idea what the answers are to what I'm talking about, but he said you all would, so it won't be a problem. And this is about job displacement. You know, AI, if it works as planned, if it works as hyped, if it works even partially as hyped, it's going to put a lot of people out of work. It's going to change a lot of jobs. You're not going to need nearly as many drivers. You may not need any drivers, to be honest. Already we're seeing AI being used to have one truck follow another truck. So you eliminate the second driver. That guy's out of a job now. We're seeing AI a lot in law, so it's not just people who do what we might think of as manual or physical jobs. You know, a lot of what lawyers do is boring, it's tedious. Doctors, AI is now in many cases advising doctors on what they should be looking at. When's it going to replace the doctor? And so again, thinking about these questions to say, now again, in Europe, the response has been nobody should ever be put out of a job. We want people to always be doing the same thing. I don't think that's going to be quite the right answer here, but one of the things we plainly failed to pay attention to in a world of globalization was what do we do about economic shift? In this case, I hope we don't make the same mistake. So these are the challenges, not just how to make these systems work together, but how can we learn from our experiences in these other areas to try to make the way in which humanity tries to develop and control AI a little more serving of kind of social goals. So let me stop there, and I would welcome your thoughts or objections or... Or you could just say, why don't you take another 15 minutes and expand on it? Because I got a lot more.
Oh, well done. Sure. So we start with Lee. We'll work our way around here. Feel free to motion, and I'll keep a tab. Yeah.
So first a comment on your last point, and then a question. So as an economic historian, we've heard this many times before. And if you go back to Veblen about the theory of the leisure class in the early 20th century, I mean, we were just, we were all just going to be, no point. Technology's going to solve everything. Nobody's going to have to work. We can redistribute income and la-da-da. Well, work just keeps going up and up. So I think the economy is really quite robust. And the alternative flip side is maybe Veblen was right with a 100-year lag, and we'll now have a lot more leisure, and we'll just have to figure out how to redistribute and to pay for this stuff. So that's the comment. I wouldn't be too worried about massive unemployment happening. I guess when I read this, you talk as if we can do a benefit-cost analysis between the cost to individual of interfering with their privacy. They know everything about Lee. And how, well, not they know everything about, Amazon knows everything about Lee. And against the social benefit. Can we make that benefit cost calculation? In other words, is the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and our own privacy data things that are not tradable, that are not a trade-off between the public good? And that seems to be a fun, where do we draw that line seems to be both a philosophical, deep question, and one that should be addressed earlier rather than later. Because once you set the train in motion, as you said, it's left the station already, and Europe's doing things differently than we are. But how do we make that trade-off between the benefits to society versus the costs to individuals of all this data collection?
So, great points, both of them. Can I just quickly touch on both? On the second one, I think it's not necessarily has to be that trade-off. In other words, I think one thing you could say is, look, Amazon and Google and all these companies have developed all this in spite of all these massive privacy laws. I mean, we've had overwhelming privacy regimes for 20 years now. They've not done a thing to slow this down, which might suggest this is a great opportunity. Let's have better privacy law that actually focuses on what individuals are harmed by or what we're concerned about, rather than that generates lots of notices and consent forms that makes lawyers happy but doesn't do anything to protect privacy. And so I don't view this necessarily in a negative way in terms of the opportunity. I view it as a real opportunity. Could we do better with AI? Could we do better with security? Could we do better with privacy? And I was actually on a conference call with someone from the Federal Trade Commission who turns out to be the US's primary privacy regulator. And they said, look, privacy's been broken, and each new technology just demonstrates that more clearly. And AI might be the one that shows the sham that our current approach is. So then we get some political motivation to go back and do better. Can we do better is, I think, the hard one there. On Veblen, the only thing I would say is, the National Academies of Sciences did a report, it came out 2 years ago, on the future of work, and they were very focused on AI and that. And their conclusion was that basically there's not enough work. Like, society does not need most of the jobs it currently has. And frankly, we have way too many lawyers and investment bankers and people who are accomplishing not a lot. And then the things that we do, like generate energy and food and things that are kind of basic to society, we could do with a tenth of the population because it's so highly automated and so forth. And the question becomes, and you said philosophical, I think that, but also economic and political. Are we willing to live in an environment in which it is not considered the gold standard to work a 60-hour work week? We all laughed at the French when they went to a 30-hour, 34-hour work week. French may have had it right. That as a practical matter, we don't need all of this. Or better yet, could we find ways to channel people out of these less productive or less needed jobs and have more artists or more culture or more support for things we really care about as a people, as opposed to just things that either pay well or are jobs you can do without enormous training. Again, huge political issue. And so I don't think AI is going to I don't believe all the hype. Let me say that. But even without any more hype, you can already see the enormous transformation already taking place.
Just one follow-up. So in 1930, 30% of the population was involved in agriculture. Today it's less than 2%.
Right. Right.
We did okay. I mean, we can, I think a robust economy adjusts and it doesn't happen instantaneously. So that, so I think we will have a whole different, and doctors won't be on this high pedestal anymore. Maybe that's a good thing, that, the robot will be. But I'm more Pollyannish about the technological change and its displacement. But,
I love optimism.
Yeah. Would be nice. Yeah, please.
I don't have this formulated perfectly, so it's going to come out really messy. I apologize for that up front. But it seems like there are two different ways you could talk about AI. One is as a technology which does certain things to produce certain answers, say. And one is as a separate use in itself. I am going to use this data for AI. And the difference that makes from a privacy analysis perspective is if you're going to do consent or agreement up front, then you have to be able to describe your uses later. And if AI is a use, then you have to say, oh, and I'm going to use it for AI. If it's a technology, then you can still talk about purpose because you're using AI for a purpose. And I'm not really convinced that AI as a purpose in itself works because it's still doing something. Like, you're using it for a reason. And so I wonder if there's actually something to talking about AI as a separate purpose, because we don't know what it does, and so we're not going to bind ourselves to any kind of result or parameters. We're just going to say, oh yeah, and we're going to dump it into this magic machine, it's going to do whatever it does, and we'll just get the little answer that it spits out. What do you think? Like, is it just another technology which is a means to an end, or is it something wholly unique? Like, is Alexa a human being-esque that we're just going to say, we're going to give it to Alexa, and she's going to do whatever she does with it?
Okay, so I think a very provocative question. I think you shifted ground in the middle of the question. In other words, between technology versus use, as opposed to between technology and something altogether new and different. And I don't think it fits any of those categories very well. In other words, if it is a use, it's a meaningless use. In other words, if I say to you, will you consent to let me use your data for AI? And you say yes, you have no idea what you've just agreed to. I could be making weapons with it. I could be making healthcare with it. You have no idea. If AI by itself is a use, I think that's a problem. But it's not just the technology either. I mean, it's way beyond a technology. And the thing that matters, I think, for most people is not what goes in, it's what comes out. It's what do you do with it. So, for example, I think it's just great you collected 1 million people using doing translations so that you can now have Google translate my bad English into bad French. I think that's a huge advantage. And I don't think they cared about who was involved. And so even though the Europeans would say that was all private information, it was a word spoken by identifiable people, I would say I'm happy to ignore all privacy law for that. Let's move on with it. As long as they don't use it in a way that then you say, well, in listening to your conversation, Pete, I discovered you're cheating on your taxes, so now I'm going to refer you for law enforcement. And you're like, whoa, wait a minute. That seems pretty intrusive and personal. And so we would be better as a practical matter to say, let's focus on the things that people in ordinary life would say, that's problematic, as opposed to, I think that's fine. Cure cancer, go ahead and do it. Try to bill me twice for the same procedure, bad idea. That's fraud. I don't think we should be enabling that. Building weapons, people might disagree. Some people would be greatly offended. So maybe there we'd say, look, you ought to have some participation in making that choice. But a lot of AI uses, a lot of this massive consumption of data has been used to establish norms that then make it possible to identify things that deviate from the norm, whether it's looking at the blood vessels of an eye or whether it's looking at a lane ahead. And I think there we may just have to say privacy law maybe doesn't play a role. And my example is always the sensors in a car. But when the Tesla sees you, it can identify you. It can recognize your gait. We can link it with data. It could put a name on you. But frankly, all Tesla really cares about is not hitting you. And I don't think we should require it to have notice and consent to do that, or we should have it state a purpose that it broadcasts on its front bumper, I'm not collecting your data other than for the purposes of not hearing you. That's where I think you would use a regulator. You would use governance to say, as long as you're within these broadly defined public serving purposes, have at it.
Yes. Yeah, you.
It's a very polite group.
I have a question and also a comment.
Of course.
It's really exciting work. I really enjoyed reading it. So the first question I have actually is, who will be responsible for AI if they made the bad decision? Like, for example, if IBM Watson makes the wrong clinical decision, will be the physician responsible for that, or will be IBM responsible for that?
Yeah, clear liability.
Yeah, and the comments I have actually is regarding the Part B, data protection, the principle and the requirements applied to AI. As a reader, I'm really interested to see if you can provide some real-world example. For example, in the data minimization part, we have really bad example right now here. Is Facebook, actually lots of apps are sending our health data or everything they collect to Facebook, even though some people are not Facebook user, they are still sending those data to them. So maybe readers are interested in what the bad example in our world right now.
So in reverse order, the way in which these principles are applied, it rarely do you have just one by itself. So for example, the court decision in Europe that said that an individual has the right to compel Google to delink to data that is now outdated. It's not minimization, that's a question of maintaining data that's outdated. So it was somebody who had been part of a bankruptcy, had recovered from bankruptcy, they no longer wanted that access. Okay, so that was the starting point of that case. Now we have the question in Europe, can they require that it be delinked everywhere, including in other countries that don't share those values? And right now the European courts are leaning in that direction. Okay, well now think of the third example. Can they require you to delete the data? Not only to delink it, but to actually remove it from the record as if it never occurred. Now from where I sit, those are all pretty bad outcomes. In other words, the person involved was a lawyer. I kind of would like to know if my lawyer had ever been involved in a bankruptcy. I don't think that data needs to be minimized. I don't think it's outlived its usefulness. But even if I do, I don't think it should be deleted from the public record. I think that data should continue to exist. And so it's a challenging issue. In other words, I understand it. Maybe for minors, we would have different rules. In the US, we do have different rules for minors so that we let them sort of overcome their past mistakes. I'm not sure for adults, for information that was true and accurately reported and not misleading, that the notion of saying for data protection purposes, for privacy purposes, we want to eviscerate that record by saying it's now outdated or it needs to be minimized. It's not necessary for this purpose any longer. On the who question, who's liable, this is of course the $1 million question. Only in this case it's a multi-billion-dollar question. And I think we have a lot of experience with liability, and we would continue to rely on that here. So we often ask kind of who was the last person who could have stopped the bad thing from happening. So like if a doctor says sever that nerve, if a computer says to a doctor sever that artery, and then the doctor does it, and a well-trained doctor would have said, no, I don't think I'm going to do that. That looks like a bad thing to do. The doctor might be the liable party. It comes about more right now with cars. So Tesla hits somebody. Tesla says, hey, we told you never take your hands off the steering wheel, never take your eyes off the road, never take your foot off the brake. You're liable. I don't think that's going to fly. And they've been advertising this car as it can drive itself, and the moment it does and it hits somebody, they say, oh, no, we didn't ever mean that. And I think their own advertising is going to cause them to face liability. I'm certain it will. I would happily bet a paycheck that they will pay for that. And in Tesla's cases, they didn't. They killed the driver, but nevertheless, there'll still be somebody to sue. I think in a longer-term way, we could actually use some rules here. And I hate to say that. I'm very libertarian by heart. I don't like rules. I break them when I encounter them. But what happens is we spend a lot of money in privacy and security maybe even a better example, chasing around liability. So, Lilly company says to its suppliers, if you do anything that causes a security breach, you're going to be liable. And the suppliers say to their suppliers, you're going to be. We just keep pushing it down till ultimately we push it to the customer. If you make the mistake of using a banking system and you lose money, you're going to be liable. And you're like, you got to be kidding me. Well, then Congress stepped in and passed a law that said, no. The bank has the obligation of a secure system, and if it results in a fraudulent transaction, the individual's made whole, the bank has to pay. And that's why we have a vibrant electronic banking. 98% of all stock transactions are done online because Congress has insulated the end user from liability. Now, there are costs to that, too. It means Scott here doesn't have to worry at all about giving me his banking password because he knows if I steal money out of his account, his bank's going to make him whole. And so maybe we've gone too far. And this is what I mean about the governance conundrum. I use the word a lot about nudges, that there are a lot of things that law and, frankly, things short of law, regulations, policies, and so forth, can do to provide sort of nudges in the market, short of rapidly and dramatically moving, for example, liability. And that would be helpful to have a public body or somebody informed by a public body who was thinking about things like that, as opposed to can we just have a battle of who's got the better lawyer.
Yes, sir.
So thanks for this paper. I think this is interesting. I don't know a lot about AI, but people talk about it.
I don't know a lot either, so we're on the same page.
Next week's blockchain.
Right. It's a sexy topic, and it's interesting.
Wow.
But
sexy topic.
Right,
I like that.
so.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
So in reading your paper, it seems like you're trying to regulate or talk about governance around the input into AI, kind of like personal information and data. But you could also kind of regulate or govern what AI can do, and then also what AI can't do. So you could put strict kind of barriers around that. I'm just wondering, where do you think we get the most value out of that? But at the same time, AI, I know this is a generalization, but it seems to be a global thing. Whereas a lot of these governance structures, especially if they're going to be formal laws, are going to be a local thing. So how is that sub-global variation going to happen? And it seems like AI is going to, so how is that going to affect the use of AI, the development of AI, and do you put any stock in maybe AI developers themselves just kind of self-governing this matter? Or do you think it needs to go to the...
So great points, all of them. So first of all, my primary concern is in keeping data protection regulators from over-regulating the inputs. Because I do think output is where we get much bigger bang for our buck. In other words, I want researchers to research the hell out of it, try it, who knows, maybe this will work. But before you release it on a car or in a surgical room or wherever, then I would like some greater guarantees that it's reliable, it's accurate, you've got power backup, all the things one might ask for in the applied setting. And so the problem is we have no application kind of regulators or lawmakers. We have little pockets of it in various places but we don't have anyone who, like, we have no general terms, no principles that say, before you unleash an AI product on the public, you must answer these 10 questions, or you should internally think about this. It's one reason I've become a big believer. In fact, I'm going to London next week to talk about data review boards as a good example of something you might set up internally in a company that would, but much the way we use human institutional review boards now, that provide some sense of oversight to say, wait a minute, have you thought about this? At minimum, can we document that you are thinking about these hard issues and you have some sense of answers for them? Again, it feels like more bureaucracy, and I just can't stand bureaucracy. But one of the things we have found, and we found in a lot of really lovely companies, I'm not picking on these companies, but you get an engineer at Apple or Google or wherever, and they get excited about something and they go charging ahead after it. And you kind of need somebody, kind of adult supervision to step in and say, wait a minute, we've got some process here before you do this. And if you look at some of the most stupid things like Facebook in particular has done over the years, it's almost always been because they did something without the slightest bit of thinking about it. Mm-hmm. And so just a little bit of, think of it like a speed bump on the information superhighway to just say, we're not going to stop you, we're not going to even assign liability necessarily, but let's at least make you document that you've thought about the critical issues. And then if something does go bad, then it's not going to work to say, oh, well, that guy just ran away. Now you're going to have somebody senior whose name's going to be at the bottom of that piece of paper. It's going to be harder for the company to act like it didn't know what was going on.
And Angie's next, then Keith.
So I write obviously in the same area and write the same ideas.
But better.
No.
I know, we're just getting there. It's all right.
No, so the pushback I get is the technology has now become so ubiquitous in our lives that yet people don't understand it. So how are we going to discover the norms? Because the technology now nudges us, creates misinformation, and so how can we ever allow sort of a democratic norm creation system when the technology is clearly influencing us from the moment we get up to the time we go to bed? And that might be your next PhD. But, so I understand but I'm just curious as to your thoughts on how we can start having this conversation with a public who's being nudged and misinformed in so many ways.
First of all, I should just say that I'm going to have a really hard time to say this, especially sitting in this room with that wall there and that incredible sense of the Ostroms looking over all of this. I actually don't believe in democratic norm setting for a lot of this, just like I don't for many things. Like, I don't understand how my car runs. No one in my family understands how my car runs, but there are about 10,000 laws that make that car reliable, plus some very strong economic forces. And as a result, my car runs really well. It's very fuel efficient. It's got batteries. It does all sorts of great things. And that didn't come about through any kind of democratic norm-setting process. There was no vote about what we thought about it. That came about largely because California and other states pushed forward legislation that car manufacturers then had to deal with. And that's partly the answer to the global point, which is we're not going to get a global norm. We can't even get a local norm. But what happens is some first movers or some movers who adopt particularly strong or ambitious approaches end up setting the norm. So today we all comply with California law because it's a big state and it sells the most cars. It gets the most cars sold in it. I don't mean there aren't places where you wouldn't want democratic norms, and then I worry about my lawmakers being affected by these technologies as well, although my experience has been generally they are so unbelievably ignorant about technologies that you first have to even educate them to be able to have like a sensible conversation. I'll always remember the discussion with the Senate Commerce Committee about cookies. And literally, by the end, I'm not sure I convinced all of them that these weren't done in an oven. I mean, there were still some who just could not get their heads around that notion because it was just such a foreign idea. I think also there are a lot, right now we have maybe the worst of all worlds. We have sort of episodic, sectoral privacy legislation that largely emerges from court cases where there's no democratic norm setting at all. So the Supreme Court tells us what's a reasonable expectation of privacy, even though there's a huge literature that says they get it wrong almost every time, that nobody agrees with their definition of reasonable. That would be actually easy for them to say, let's find out, do you think this is reasonable? But they ignore it no matter how clearly it's given to them. So we can almost not do worse than we're doing right now in terms of trying to have a thoughtful conversation about what are the things we worry about, how might we address those, and to what extent do we let societal views trump individual views. I don't know. I think we're gonna have to. I mean, we're doing it already all the time. It's happening all around us, but without any conversation about what do you think about that? You know, Delta's testing gates in Atlanta now that rely on your retinal scan. So then they do the image recognition. They recognize your scan. It's artificial intelligence. It pulls up your record and simultaneously pulls up whether you're on a watch list. So that if you've been added to a watch list between when you checked in and when you got to the gate, they can block you, and then it either lets you on or it doesn't let you on. Well, right now, because they're testing it, they have lots of people in red coats standing around busily looking at you. But you know in 5 years there's going to be no human at that gate. They'll have fired all of those red coats, and we'll be standing there, and it won't be letting me on because like I've had eye surgery or because I've been confused with somebody else. And so, for example, one good place in my world to start, I think this point is made somewhere in here. If not, Rachel left it out. But it's just about redress. Just to say, look, if you're going to use AI in a way that has a fundamental action that affects a human, you've got to provide instant redress. None of this telephone menu after the fact stuff.
Just a quick question while we're on the topic. You mentioned California leading the way in environmental laws. Obviously, similarly, that's happening in privacy and even IoT security. And other states have made some noise. Former Governor Hickenlooper talked about Colorado maybe doing something similar. And I'm wondering, since we're not going to get a global AI treaty anytime soon, do you see a California or a Massachusetts or a Colorado being helpful in some way in setting the stage that would then become kind of a default standard that other states would just have to adopt because all of a sudden many manufacturers are looking to it for guidance?
So let me first say I'm from California, and then say, as a rule, California is never helpful. In this case, what we're going to end up with are some very quirky pieces of legislation. In this case, a bill that was adopted in an effort to get a ballot initiative off the ballot, adopted on a deadline. Nobody had even seen it before it was adopted. And now they already have an amendment bill because of the number of mistakes in the bill itself. That's what happens when you write bills in an afternoon. It was written in an afternoon. And it doesn't deal with any of the issues we've talked about. So, for example, it gives you the right to block the resale of your information on an online site. I think that might be useful. I'm not opposed to that. But none of these hard issues, like that's a dead easy issue. And moreover, one of the things we've learned, if you give people the right to consent to something, there is no situation in which a smart person won't be able to persuade them to consent. So as long as we continue in the notice and consent world, we will get you to consent to anything. It will make no difference. And we got, again, lots of studies about that. Internet Explorer 8 was the first one to bring up the red, do not go to this site. You get a pop-up thing that says this is a known phishing site. Do not go here. And then we've got this massive click-through rate. I mean, really, this is the same reason I don't want a democratic standard. Like at that point, I want a mechanic to say, my car should do this. I want a cybersecurity person to say, you're just not going to go to that site. It's known. And that's going to be really hard because we love this kind of illusion of consent. I don't think it's overly real, but we base so much of our approach, especially in this country, but in much of the English-speaking world and many other places, on this notion that you can, as long as you consent, we can do anything to you. And it's funny, we have this debate inside the university all the time, and I've always found it interesting, and I still find it interesting, about asking employees for consent. So like if you go to look at your pay stub, it'll give you a paragraph of disclosure about how dangerous it is to look at your pay stub, and you shouldn't do it, and you shouldn't do it on an unsecured machine, and you shouldn't, and then you click I agree, and you go through. So I just asked, has anyone ever not gone through? Nobody, absolutely no one. Do you know what that disclosure says? I mean, has anyone ever read it, actually, other than, I'm paid to read it, so. And so at some point, maybe we need a stronger system of saying, if you provide people with something that could be dangerous, you may have to take steps to reduce the danger or to more clearly focus on where the danger is, as opposed to these general sliders that say, I agree, and now it's off to the races.
Keith.
So I came in late, so did you mention the executive order that was signed February 11th?
I did not.
Okay, so let me...
oh yes, I did, in detail. Yes, I've covered that thoroughly. No, I haven't.
So let me summarize it briefly.
Yeah, I know
Then get to my question, which is more about how we regulate AI, right? So the President Trump signed Executive Order February 11th on essentially developing a federal strategy for coordination across agencies on AI. And it has 5 principles which deal with, it's very positive toward AI. It's to promote technological breakthroughs, to foster public trust, and that's the one that I thought was most interesting, because Section 6 of the executive order gets to regulation and standards, right? So it requires NIST to develop within 6 months, I think. Standards for AI, broadly defined. We have to know what, it's up to, how technical these are or social they are, the standards. It also gives OMB and OIRA a role for 6 months to come up with a regulatory plan that all agencies will then have to develop their own regulatory plan that comports with the OMB plan. And I find it interesting because I think there are like 3 important questions as if you're a regulatory agency, how you go about doing this. And I think the first question is, how is AI already regulated, right? I mean, in the manufacturing world, which I know a little bit better, there are lots of instances we already know of where AI and machine learning is already being regulated through existing regulatory programs, of which there are no shortage of regulatory programs across the federal government focused on applications, right? So knowing what they're already doing, I think, is a pretty important input before you develop a plan for what you're going to do in the future.
Clearly a radical.
Yeah, the second question, which I think is more interesting, is what are issues unique to AI? Regulatory issues that are unique that might arise. And that's what regulators, I think, need to really focus in on, because I think by and large, a lot of these application-based regulations are dealing with AI applications in a lot of cases in ways that aren't that controversial. But it's what are the unique attributes of AI? And so I think the unique attributes of machine learning that are interesting to regulators is one would be bias built into the algorithms that result in bias applications toward a group or prejudice or et cetera. Another is explainability. There's a lot of how do you audit an algorithm that's so complicated to know what it actually did, right? And DoD is doing a lot of work on explainable AI, which is an interesting term. I'm not sure if you can ever truly get there, but if there's like a train accident or a plane crash or a bad automobile accident on an interstate highway, there's an investigation. You want to know who's to blame. And why did the car veer this way, or why did the plane not let, what in the algorithm caused it to function? So explainability issues are going to be really important. And then evolution, right? So FDA, when they approve a medical device, they want to see what that medical device looks like. They want to know that once they approve it, it's always going to look like that medical device. Well, what if you have a medical device that's based on an algorithm that changes over time? How do you approve that, right? And FDA's grappling with that, and they've already started regulating AI-enabled devices. But I think it's an interesting exercise under the executive order, because it's not just how it's already being used, because I think that most of our regulatory programs cover that. It's these unique aspects of AI that are going to be interesting. And then the third question I hope that regulators ask themselves is, how are regulators themselves going to use AI to be better regulators? And that's a very interesting question, and it's totally absent from the executive order, right? I mean, these regulators are going to come up with how they want the private sector regulated, but they ought to be talking about how they're going to use and how they're using AI today to be better regulators and make that information public as well. So I find the whole executive order in the process very interesting and raises all sorts of interesting issues, but it's also a way, I think, to educate people. It's not like this is a futuristic thing. We have AI applications all over the place, and we're already regulating them. But I think the unique aspects of AI are going to come out and lead to an interesting public debate. And I wonder if you comment on that very long.
Yeah, no, happily. I don't think at the moment we could really point to unique aspects of AI. In other words, bias. Bias is in everything, absolutely everything. So I show up at the border, I go see a border and immigration agent. I'm usually dressed well, I'm white, I'm male, I usually have no trouble. I walk through, I look for that person who's going to treat me favorably. Now a machine's not going to have that bias. It may have some other bias. In other words, its bias, it won't be because it's being random, it will be its bias is because it's collected a lot of data and it's what it thinks that data tells it to do. So the question, I think, in all of these areas is really more of how does AI change what we already are dealing with? In other words, we deal with bias every single day. What does bias in AI look like? Now, bias in AI is easy to document, much easier than with humans. So we should love AI for this reason, because you've got the record, every single time who it let through and who it didn't let through. There's no fudging it, there's no anything. Similarly, explainability, I've never understood this issue. We don't understand anything in our lives, not a thing. Pick up your cell phone, use it, and then explain to me how it works. Explainability is just not part of our lives. What instead we look at is reliability and predictability. Does it do what I expect? So when I pick up my phone and I hit the button and it freezes, which it does a lot, I'm annoyed, not because it can't explain to me what it's doing, but because it's not doing what I think it should be doing. And so a great thing about AI is it actually makes it really easy to start picking out these things that we want to know what happened. So I don't need to know how the algorithm worked. I need to know, did it try to break and the break failed, or did it not try to break? And then I just keep reverse engineering till I find where the failure was. And so it's one of the things, particularly in the data protection community, they talk about explainability like we're talking about teaching. I'm going to have a classroom of elementary school students, and I'm going to explain AI to them. And there's a wonderful line, I think I quoted in the paper from Paul, who's now at Georgetown, about how do you explain the unexplainable.
Right.
I mean, that's the whole point, that AI, so much of what it does is based on, again, this is his phrase, a world of surprising correlations. Well, that's the point. They're surprising. If we knew how to do them, we had been doing them. So maybe a better word would be auditability or reverse engineerability. And then your last point, of course, is more, I think, characteristic of AI, which is AI may change every single time. I mean, the AI that's operating on me today may not be the AI from yesterday. It's learned something. It's not because it's been upgraded. It may have been upgraded as well, but it's because it's taken in more data and it's internalizing that data to do something. So again, to my mind, although I think we should absolutely, rather than ignore the problem, we should use existing models as far as possible. But I think it's a great time to actually rethink some of our approaches to regulating things or to governing things that affect us, maybe as a way of improving the governance structure itself. So we might do better for security, and we might do better for data protection, we might do better for manufacturing by asking these hard questions that AI is now presenting, but I would argue that we've always faced these questions, just in different ways.
Excellent. I put myself on the list really quick, and then we have, I think, 2 or 3 hands over here. So we'll go down the list. Just really briefly, though, one of the solutions was data stewardship, of course. And I have to say, the preface is I just finished Zucked over the weekend, which is this new book about insider at Facebook. And obviously they talk a lot about fiduciary duties that Jonathan Citrin, among others, has talked about. This as being part of the answer. We need fiduciary duties as applied to data. And I'm wondering what you think about that. Should that apply to this idea of data stewardship in some helpful way? And relatedly, we had this discussion at our Colloquium last week as well, kind of picking up a thread from earlier, about how we even define harm here. And in the paper, you talk about some useful frameworks, kind of based around risk management, to define kind of a typology of harms, perhaps. And it seems to me we're treating AI as a very monolithic thing with a lot of applications and a lot of effects at a lot of scales. And I'm wondering if you've come across, or maybe that's something that we can think through as well, what a useful framework would be to start to think through how in the world you approach, governance, including at what level and at what type, since everything from, Skynet on down to a plane crash could be at fault. Anyway, several points there, but feel free to respond to whatever you like.
Yeah, hard. Sorry, we don't have time for me to answer those. But,
yeah, right, no, absolutely.
So, the stewardship, I think, actually is a critical issue here, and that necessarily, to my mind, means some sort of fiduciary duty.
Yeah.
And I think it means being clear on the way in which the data was collected as to what that duty might be. So in other words, if you're one out of a million people who were caught up in a file that I'm using to train my AI, I might have a different duty to you than if I collect the data from you, like I'm your doctor, I'm your lawyer, I'm your professor, whatever, and that would carry a different duty. And so we need to not think of this in terms of sort of monolithic one-size-fits-all, but rather as a more kind of subtle, but again, we have a lot of experience with that. We already recognize privileged and not privileged situations and so forth. But I think part of stewardship, this is why I come back to things like data review boards or whatever, is saying not just we have an obligation to treat your data in some responsible way, but also we have some way to document that we're doing that. And whether we document it to you, or whether we document it to a regulator, or whether we document it to an advocacy group, all three very important, but I think very, very different. And a perfect example of where I think we've just failed at this miserably has been breach notices. Again, something I get from California. We get millions, hundreds of millions of breach notices a year. We know we have excellent data. About half of them are never opened. They're not read at all. By the time you've gotten your second or third notice, nobody's reading them either. And so then, we used to say the purpose of a breach notice was to embarrass the company or to empower the individual to do something. Well, we know by the time you get a breach notice, it's way too late to do anything. So that was never true. Embarrassing the company, who's not had a breach? I mean, really, who is embarrassed anymore? I mean, it's affected a few stock prices and things like that. Some CEOs have lost their job. That's another form of embarrassment. But again, if embarrassment's our goal, we could do that much easier by saying you just have to report it to the state attorney general, and the state attorney general will publish a list. We can accomplish all the embarrassment in the world without also cutting down all the trees and mailing all that notices and so forth. So again, being clear about what the stewardship actually involves, like what is the goal, what are the tools, what is the desired outcome. On harm, there has been lots of work on this. I mean, I've done a lot of it. Many other much more talented people have done a lot of it. I don't think anyone has sort of a perfect solution. I was just in a conference call with the National Academy of Sciences on Friday about this. They're putting in place a study to look at the question of harm and privacy. And they were saying was 2 years a reasonable time for it. And I'm like, you should give it 90 days because there has been so much work done. What you really need is a literature review. Bring it together, say what works, what doesn't work, and then narrow it down to 3 models for Congress to consider or for someone to recommend. I don't mean to suggest harm is easy, but the fact that we've really not used it, and unfortunately in the US, most of our concept of harm has come from courts. And courts, because of standing rules and because of other constraints, tend to have a pretty narrow view of harm. I mean, you usually have to show economic harm or physical harm. You have to show causation, proximate cause, and suddenly nobody's been harmed. Well, I don't think any of us believe that. I mean, surely people are harmed by data. And so we need, again, a more thoughtful, but again, this is not starting over. I mean, there are dozens of good examples of harm matrices and ways of defining it, and even all the way down to lists of these things. We've got polling data on what the public considers to be harms from data. That could be your next book.
God, no. But that's brilliant. Thank you so much. Should we go down? Maybe perhaps a lightning round. Should we get? Because I think there was at least 3 hands over here. Should we start? Share some? Work our way down.
My only question was, Stephen Hawking was famously against AI, but I think it's a different type of AI. So I was just wondering how your ideas kind of contribute to that concern that he and I think Elon Musk might.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's a very.
If it's relevant, but I know it's a lightning round, so.
Yeah, I don't. I'm not against AI. In other words, I think it's a reality. I think it has all sorts of potential. And I'm a diabetic. I live on a pump. It's governed by AI. I'd be dead. So I'm pretty supportive of being alive. But at the same time, I do think it raises enormous issues that we need to get our hands around. And I don't want to be a victim of AI any more than I have to. So I don't mean to suggest we can do perfectly. But the current sort of head in the sand approach strikes me as not. We should expect better of ourselves and the people who are responsible for our governance.
Ellie?
Yeah, just two comments. I think a lot of the discussion is that AI, or let's just call them algorithms, are substitutes for humans. And I like to think of them as complements. Where an algorithm doesn't work is in the black swan event, because algorithms aren't programmed for that. So that's where the outliers and human discretion, really matters. So I think, having that in the debate as we process to algorithms getting perfect, which they never will because there'll always be black swan events, I think is a useful thing to keep in mind. I mentioned it last week about a pilot telling me, experienced pilot saying, young pilots can't fly planes.
Right.
They just put it on program. But when stuff happens, I don't want that young guy flying that plane because he doesn't know how to do it. So, I think as a complement, they're wonderful. Where most time pilots are up there doing whatever they're doing, they're not flying the plane. Technology is. The other thing, and this fits my libertarian streak too, and I guess yours, is we don't know how to regulate. So why not have a lot of experimentation? Just as we do with marijuana. Let's have, people taking shots at it rather than global regulation when we don't know what the hell we're doing. Let's have a competition and hope that, we learn from other states where it seems to work, or we learn from other countries where it seems to work. So I would like to see more regulatory competition rather than national and global rules about how to deal with AI.
So I agree strongly with both of those points, but let me say I think the first one may be wrong. Even though I completely agree with you, I think we may be wrong together. which is I think AI holds the potential for being a better choice in the moment of an emergency than a human. And it will depend on the setting and the type of an emergency.
Yes.
But you give me a plane crashing, I'm not sure that I want a pilot anymore. And just think about the plane in Indonesia where they kept trying to force it down and the plane was trying to fly itself. If they had left the plane alone, it might have been better off than the intervention. And so it's going to depend. It's going to be subtle.
Yeah.
It's not going to be one size fits all.
I mean, it would be great to catalog all those instances where, which one would do better, which do you want doing it. And I think, I agree with you. I think we're on that road to where we want machines to be doing it. Mm-hmm. But for now, let's call them complements, but it's up for debate.
Yes. 2 quick questions. One, is it okay if we never understand how it works and we just let it do its thing? Like from a privacy perspective. Like
Yes.
we don't know, it does magical things and we just leave it alone.
Yes.
Second question is, if we do need to figure out how it works, the only way we can do that is to reverse logic it. And it seems like we have 2 choices. One is it could be a technical thing, which is it can tell you precisely what decisions it made. The other one is we've built it so organically that it goes, dude, you told me to do the right thing, I did it. I did the right thing. I did what I thought was the right thing. Here's my reasoning, but in the end, it just felt right. Like, is that an acceptable answer from AI?
No, nor is it a likely answer in like our lifetimes. In other words, I think the one thing that we often forget, one of the ways to really test AI and to audit it, so on both ends, is to give it situations and see what it does.
Right.
And so if you think AI is biased, give it 1,000 cases and see what it does. Right. If it turns out to consistently discriminate against African Americans, it's biased. There's no question about it. But I don't know that you're always going to be able to predict it by looking at the code or even by looking at the input data. This is really hard, and it's really hard for me. I mean, I'm a history major undergraduate and a lawyer, for God's sake. But, this isn't like a credit score where you say, oh, there are 1,000 things we put in and it comes out with this score. What if we adjust this one a little bit? What happens? That's like easy. That's like elementary school stuff to what a lot of this AI is doing. And it's just astonishing and terrifying all at the same time. And that's why my answer to the first question was yes. If it works, and it works consistently, and it works as we give it a wide variety of circumstances, I think we're going to be happy to just have it work. Not the data protection regulators of France, but the rest of us are going to be happy.
Just really quick on that, then Angie, and then we'll finish out. Oh no, it's great. The MIT Moral Machine kind of experiment. I was kind of curious. Have you been following that? If you think that's going to have much, if experiments like that are going to be useful in thinking through ethical AI and how we can actually approach this in a more
I
sound
don't
manner.
think it's going to be terribly useful, but I do think we should be experimenting with ways to help us think through these issues and ways to translate often highly theoretical or incredibly complicated and very fast concepts into things that we can work with, that we can make sense out of. I don't spend my nights and weekends worrying about waking up in a world where how the computer is telling me what to do. But I have to say, it doesn't feel like it's impossible any longer. Like, I would have told you 20 years ago it was impossible. Computers were just so unreliable, they weren't that good, And now, the way in which we embrace them, it's not just the technology, it's our fascination with technology. And the way in which people will run out and pay thousands of dollars for something without a clear need or purpose, and forget understanding it, trusting it, anything. And so it makes me think we could walk headlong into a future that might turn out to be very dystopian. So even though that is not what motivates me, that's not why I do this work, that's not, but it is something that, again, 20 years ago I would have not have put on my list of the possible.
And then we have basically 1 minute left. So one last comment for me. So you talked about governance. We wanted to find different models. I did a quick search, and there's only one paper out there talking about polycentric governance and AI. So for what it's worth, there might be an interest. I did not. So I'm happy to send the link, but it could be an interesting, I could send it to you, Rachel, as well, guidepost to think through. But if you have any concluding thoughts, Rachel or you, Fred, to kind of round us out here at the top of the hour.
I thought it was an interesting discussion. I find it kind of a unique issue, but a lot of things that we are looking at are things that we've looked at before and just not answered correctly, or not. I mean, maybe we didn't know at the time, but I think there are a lot of other areas where we can pull in. You know, we've seen liability dumping across various sectors, and we just, you know, create a new contract and a new person signs it. And so interesting comments. I appreciated everyone's thoughts on the matter. It's interesting to have a diverse set of people in the room. So I appreciated all of your participation.
Happy to sort
Thank you
of
very
for
much. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much.